Our first speaker for this evening really needs no introduction. I know that's a cliche, but if ever it should be used, it's perhaps in this case. She's had a glorious career of over 5 decades in cinema. What really strikes me personally about her is how effortlessly and with the impeccable grace and elegance that is synonymous with her, she has traversed the gulf between tradition and modernity in her personal life and between artistic excellence and commercial success in her professional life. That is not all. There are many other roles that she has taken on. That of the censor board chief, for instance, or one half of one of India's most celebrated couples, or perhaps the head of a family of superstars and celebrities. There's any number of facets to this person who we have the privilege of having as our guest this evening. And in order to celebrate her life before we call her on, we've put together a short film that I hope you will enjoy. Well, now, particularly now that you've seen the film, you will not be surprised to learn that for all her myriad roles, to me, while growing up, she was simply the most beautiful woman who walked this earth. So I'm delighted to welcome Sharmila Tagore.
Thank you, Pragya, for this wonderful introduction. Of course, she assured us a warm welcome, but I was not taking her words. I brought my shawl. Because all these hotels are incredibly cold, So I wasn't taking a risk. And when, one gives this long introduction and saying all this, that, and the other in terms of excellence, you feel as if it's somebody else. And you feel kind of thoroughly embarrassed, at least I do. But it was nice to look back in that sort of 60 years span. It's nice. I mean, I like this idea of being recorded. Yeah. And at the time that I was working, I used to squirm. I said, oh God, it's terrible and it can be better. And, why am I doing this? It's awful. But now when I look back, I rather like it. Thank you.
That is the best thing one can feel.
I think distance makes the heart grow fonder. Yes.
So let's start at the beginning, if I may. You are a sort of accidental actress, if one might use that phrase, because you were found by Ray. And when people usually use that term, they mean that you went and auditioned and, stood in a line, and you were quite literally approached by Ray in your house and taken into cinema. How did that happen?
He was looking, he had already made his name in Bengal, and he had made these two beautiful films, Pothir Panchali and Operajito. So he was making, this is Apu, the teenager's journey through life, and he was making the third one, and which was called Apur Sangshar, and he was looking for a wife for Apu, and had to be a child bride, because there's a story, whoever has seen this film would know how that marriage happens. So he was looking for a very, very young person, and at that time, working films was really frowned upon, and he was not finding anybody. And he had his scouts in front of all the schools or wherever young people go. So my sister Tinku had already worked in Kabuliwala, and the Bengali Kabuliwala, and she was 5 years old, and she became she was wonderful. So he thought perhaps this family won't have any objection to, to films, which was a very, very bad thing. Despite it being, Ray's film. So somebody must have spotted me in front of the schools. I don't know how, but one morning the phone rang, and Rai's voice was on the other side, asking me to work in the film. And I think my father instantly said yes, because already there was so much chat in the house about how he was winning awards abroad, etc., etc. So he was quite an icon. And so he loved it. He said, of course, if she's good, then take her, otherwise, most certainly don't. But nobody, of course, bothered to ask me, and nobody bothered to ask my school principal. She had a lot to say. And she says, oh my God, films. And she'll be such a terrible influence on the other girls. Because, it's after all films, which is a very sinful thing. So there was that problem. And my father, of course, said, in that case, there is no option. She has to leave your school. So I was going to a Bengali medium school. And I had to make that transition to Loreto, where my sister was already. It's a long story, but I was staying with my grandparents because of my education, etc. So I lived with them. And my father was being transferred from one place to another. So Tinku was already, my sister who had acted in this mini and was a star already, was staying with them. So I had to go to Loreto and adjust to this English medium school at the age of 13, which wasn't fun, which was pretty bad. But that's how it happened. And it just changed my life.
Speaking of changing your life, the first scene that you shot with Ray was quite prophetic in a sense. It would be lovely if you could actually recount that scene for the audience.
Well, actually I thought of it, when I was shooting it, it didn't strike me. We were all given this script. Everybody had this script, but we were not encouraged to memorize the dialogues. He didn't want us to do that. He wanted us to read, and this was this beautiful handwritten scripts with even images. The frames were, and he was an illustrator, as you know. So there was this, it's like all my scripts are there and they're little treasures, yes. So the first scene was when Apu gets married. He attends a party. He goes for a friend's cousin's wedding to this rural place, and it happens so that the groom who's come to marry Apurna is mad. The way he behaves, you can make out that he is not quite the right person. So the mother objects. Mother says, on no account my daughter will marry that person. But according to Hindu tradition and customs those days, if that lagna, the time, the muhurat of that time is not adhered to, then she cannot marry again. Then she remains aiburo, sort of unmarried. So that was the crisis. So the friend goes and asks Apu, will you marry her? So Apu says, I don't earn a bean. I don't know where I'm staying. How can I marry? So anyway, there's emotional blackmail, and he agrees to marry her. And the first scene is that and there is a scene when after they get married and he asks her, will you be able to adjust with my poverty, etc. And after a long spiel, she sort of hears him out and says, yes, I will. Parbo. And so then the next scene is this. The first days of shooting, there's a closed door, and Soumitra and I are standing outside of that door, and inside the door is the camera with the crew, the DOP and assistants and blah, blah. And the door is closed, and on the other side, Ray's voice rings out, start sound, camera, action. And on action, Soumitra opens the door and looks at me. He enters the room, he looks back at me and says, Esho. I'm still in my bridal costume. And so I tentatively, and he gives me space for me to enter. So I cross the threshold and walk into the room, and then Manikda says, I used to call him Manikda, and he says, look right, look left, take one step forward, look up, raise your shoulders, cut, excellent, next shot. So that was my first day's shooting. But I was thinking later, much later, that Aparna, the character, and Sharmila Tagore, I, probably were feeling the same thing, that we didn't know what lay across that door. And so I think my frame of mind and Aparna's frame of mind must have been the same. And maybe that's why he chose that scene for the first day. And as far as your prophecy, or you're saying that it was a very prophetical, that crossing the threshold meant that I was going from this life to another life. And yes, to me, it symbolizes a complete change of life, because my life was going in a particular way. I was going to go to Shantiniketan like everybody else did, and I was probably going to, I don't know, art or music or something else.
You came from a family of artists.
Yes. So Manikda changed my life.
I mean, trust him to be the artist in
Yeah, and
life as in cinema.
What a privilege it has been, professionally and personally, to know such a person.
You know, my all-time favorite film is Devi, which is the film that you did after Opur Shonshar, and I was reading somewhere that you can still consider it one of your best, if not your best performances, and that really intrigued me. How many of you in the audience have seen Devi, may I ask? Okay, not very many of you. I'm going to let Sharmila ji tell you a little bit about the film, because I really want her to talk about why she thinks that the second film she did in such a long career is one of her most special films.
It was very different from Opur Shonshar. Opur Shonshar was it was a romance, really. Although, I became the heartthrob of the nation, of Kolkata and Bengal, because it was beautiful romance. Even now, 4 generations later, or 5 generations later, when people see that, they still react to that. I mean, it has nothing to do with money or anything. It's just being together. And also, it's like the nucleus family. It's unheard of that a girl of that age would leave her mother. I mean, usually the practice was they would get married and be sent back. But here they start a home together with all their inexperience. They make a go of it. So that's Opur Shonshar, but the Devi was completely different. And it was a very, very dark story. The time was 19th century, late, mid-19th century, where there was a very timid, tentative rise of reformism. You know, Ram Mohan Roy and others together were trying to do something like remarriage of widows, etc. But the orthodox, superstitious, prejudiced mindset prevailed. And Rai chooses, or rather, whoever wrote the Prabhat Mukherjee, chooses this zamindar of a rich background to tell this story. He is the patriarch of the family. He's a believer of Kali. Kali, who's a destroyer, as well as the how would you say, the opposite of destroyer, the keeper of the creator of, yes. And the Uma and the son, played by Soumitra Chatterjee, is not comfortable with his father's behavior and, dominant orthodoxy and blind prejudice. But he doesn't have the character to stand up to him or defy his father's authority. Then he goes away to study, as was the norm then, because he's also a very young man. He goes to Calcutta to study. And his father, one night, has this dream that his daughter-in-law is the reincarnation of Kali. So he wakes up in the middle of the night and he knocks on the door of this girl, of this very young, impossibly young, illiterate little girl, who's Dayamoi, the wife of Uma. And she comes out, with her head covered and all that. And he falls at her feet, calling her Ma, Ma, very devotional way. And what follows is really pure cinema, because it captures her revulsion and this bizarre turn of event, and her, completely withdrawing it just through images, and her, scratching, how that sound that happens when you are clawing the wall, and and then she's just taken away from everything that she is attached to, the nephew that she was very fond of, and she's put in a corner and is worshipped on a daily basis. And the other daughter-in-law, who's educated, who's even compassionate, who's a little more rational, and she writes a letter to Uma to come here and see what is happening. But she also doesn't have the nerve to shed years of orthodox conditioning. So there is nobody to help this little girl, and she doesn't have, she cannot assert her will to reclaim her identity, because she's impossibly young and she cannot possibly think that her father-in-law can be wrong. And she thinks, perhaps I could be Devi, And Uma, of course, comes and they try to run away. And at the last minute, she cannot, because she has been conditioned to put her family before herself. And she also buys into what the father-in-law is telling her, that you might be Devi, and if I run away with you, suppose something terrible happens to you. So she finally doesn't go. And this continuous, relentless assault of being worshipped every day, finally destroys her mind. And so it's a very tragic story, told in a very dark, foreboding atmosphere. So it's a very, very challenging role. And every time I see it, I feel that not even a scene can be changed, not even one editing can be changed. And of course, Manikda ran into a lot of problem when the film was released, because he was attacked by the Orthodox Hindus, and they said that because you're a Brahmo, you've changed your religion, that's why you've made this film. So his argument was that it is not against Hinduism per se, but it's against the orthodox blind prejudice of the religion that I'm discussing in this film. So most certainly it was a very, very challenging role.
If I'm not mistaken, it was possibly one of the only two films, if not the only film of his, that didn't do well at the box office.
Yes,
is that
this
correct?
and Kapurush.
Kapurush,
people
yeah.
rejected the film, but I still feel that it was just a very, very, very good film.
And of course, it's very celebrated now.
Very relevant also, because in the name of honor, family, everything, the women continue to suffer injustice. And as long as the true enlightened aspect of religion continues to elude mankind, and religion is used to perpetuate ignorance and superstition, this film will most certainly remain relevant and a must-see for anyone who is interested in good cinema.
So you know what you're watching next weekend. But you know what intrigues me is that you started working with Manikda when you were 13, and then you go on working with him. You do Devi. I believe you were also offered Kanchenjunga, but you couldn't do it. But then, of course, you did Shima Bhatto, then you did Nayok. Maybe I'm getting the order wrong, but Arunir Din Ratri. And you're growing up as, you know, and so is your relationship as an actor with the director and with the person. What was that evolution like?
Well, with the first two films, I was very young, but then later I, became, and I was already started to work in Bombay, so I was far more. So I would ask him questions, and I would engage with him, and he became my mentor really, because I learned how to look at cinema, how to be in front of the camera, the value for committing yourself to a project, because he was the hardest working person I've ever met. So he had many qualities that I could imbibe just by watching him and his preparations. And he could do every aspect of filmmaking, from wardrobe to camera to writing, and he just took money for two things, which is direction and writing the screenplay. But otherwise, he had control over. In fact, when he started, because Bollywood, of course, has got a global market, but it shouldn't be forgotten that he was the first one who made the world sit up and take note of Indian cinema, because before that, they were not really interested in Indian cinema. For the next 40 years, he was the flag bearer of internationally, and he did this with a meager budget. If Kurosawa, and he was competing with Kurosawa, he was competing with Bergman, and with the others who had so much money, whereas he had no money. The conditions that he worked in, the studio floors were uneven, he didn't have proper lights, and that's why they improvised the bounce light which everybody uses, which is DOP, Shubhrata Mitra, another genius. So they were very, very good, and he always said that, in the cinema there is, like everything in Indian music is so good, Indian art is so good, but not much has been done in the cinema field. And that's why I want to make cinema. But there also has to be a style and an idiom or a part of the iconography which has to be recognizably Indian, uniquely Indian. And that is what he did. And that is why his films spoke eloquently to his home audience as well as abroad. It managed to cut across the culture and the language barrier. And that is why he won so many international awards. And that is why he was given the Lifetime Achievement Award by the Oscars, finally, by the Academy. Because these were Indian in color. Because many people ask me that why do Indian films, they're so good, but why don't they get the best foreign film at the Oscars? Why not? Because what is Indian? They are seeing, so when you see a Turkish film or you see a Chinese film, everything is uniquely, recognizably that. Whereas Indian films are not, because of our language, and English has become a link language, and now it's Hinglish really, which is no language at all. But yes, so we have created a new language called Hinglish, or Pinglish, or Binglish, or Tinglish. But so it's not, what is India and what is an Indian ethos right now? Because it's a bit of a hodgepodge. So it doesn't, when somebody, like even Gully Boy, if it goes abroad, it'll be, they will equate it with the black. That's what they've seen. It has happened, right? So when you see Once Upon a Time in Anatolia, the Turkish film, it's not. It's totally, and if you see Pather Panchali on one of Rai's films, they're absolutely Indian. In fact, Calcutta and Bengal. And yet, when you see it, it reaches you at that human, at a feeling level, so that essential humanism that cuts across everything and reaches to the deepest part of your heart or soul or whatever. And that's why his films remain so relevant and so popular in France. In France, they just love his films.
Everywhere, and we are two Ray fans on this stage, so if we continue talking about him, we'll probably take up all the time.
Not. So I think you
Yes,
better
yes.
go to Bollywood very quickly.
Yes, but no, I want to come back to you rather. I'm curious, you know, after Devi, was there any point at which you first felt that confidence that someone feels as a professional that, yeah, I can act? You know, is outside of any crutch, I can act. Is that something you ever remember
I think,
feeling?
you know, when there is a big tree, nothing grows underneath it. So, I don't know. I got my confidence going away from home and going away from everything that is been known to me, you know. So I think by trial and error, that confidence, because here it's somebody who tells you everything. And of course you come across looking very good in his films, but how much of it is you and how much of it is him? And everybody actually will give him the credit. But of course, you know, we also grew in stature and capability. But it was in Bombay that I really found myself.
But it must have been quite a culture shock, your decision to go to Bombay. The first film you did was Kashmir Ki Kali, and from this world of Ray's cinema, and of course the way Calcutta is as a place overall, and how cinema is perceived and spoken of, and then to come to Bombay and to do a film like Kashmir Ki Kali with this, you know, mercurial superstar Shami Kapoor, and of course in a different language, you know, lip syncing songs. How did you adapt to that culture shock?
Well, the Bengalis were very, very upset that how can our girl and how can Rai find, you know, go and do these song and dance movies with none other than Shami Kapoor, who was sort of rolling down the mountain or jumping into the river. Yes, but I was young and restless, and I wanted to go beyond. I mean, naturally, one wants to go beyond regional cinema to the national arena. It's not that I was all that. I was pretty young. I had grown up from 13. I was about 16, 17 at that point. So I was still young. And I went to Bombay, and I was, of course, not chaperoned. I stayed alone in a hotel, so I became immediately a social suspect because everybody was being chaperoned those days, and the girls wore white and they, you know, sat in one place, and I would get up and dance with people because I was in Calcutta. I was G.N. Tagore's daughter. Everybody knew me, and I was brought up in a particular way, and my mother obviously couldn't leave her to other young children and come to chaperone me. So, but it worked out very well because after all it gave me economic independence, which I wanted. And it's nice, you grow when you are away from your parents and from everything, from your support system basically, and you learn. And also, I mean, it's not that I was alone. I was surrounded by Bengalis because there was Shakti Samanta, there was Sachin Bhaumik, there was Bimal Roy, there was Rishikesh Mukherjee. So they were all from Bengal. And they all kept a very strict parental eye on me. So I was not allowed to do many things. But it was very different. It was a leap of faith. I mean, every time I never really lost touch with Bengali films while I continued to work in Bombay films, not just Rai, but even other films. So every time I would work come back to Bengal and work, they would say, but Rinku, as they would call me, you know, this is a Bengali film. So you have to really think and pause and then deliver your lines. And then when I would go and work in Bombay, they'll say, this is not a Rai film, for God's sake. Can you speed it up a little bit? So you know, I mean, call it whatever, but you know, to be in the same country with two different industries and two different way of telling stories, was interesting because in any regional film, there's an instant identification because everybody wears the same clothes, whether it's the maidservant or the office, so they talk the same language, the location is more or less the same, so it's identifiable. In my time when I was working, the lady of the house would be wearing a sari perhaps, the maid would be wearing a ghagra choli, and somebody will be wearing something else. And there'll be many aspects, diverse aspects, somewhere creating a harmony. So every time you watched the Hindi films, you had to temper it with a little bit of, like you couldn't expect 100% reality. Because they had to cater to entire India. And every I'm just giving a rough figure, every 100 or 160 miles or something, the sensibilities differ. India, and that is what my gain from working in Bombay has been, to travel in India and to understand, how people are different, and yet the commonality, how it always transcends the differences. Because all our films are, I remember Chennai was very anti-Hindi when Aradhana was released, and there was many protests and serious protests, right? And Aradhana ran here for 50 weeks. And at the same place people laughed, at the same place people cried, at the same place people, well, in Aradhana there was no getting bored, but in other films people got bored. At the same place, whether it's Assam or whether it's Chennai or whether it's Kashmir or whether it's anywhere else. So that's India. The pluralism of India is something defies and imagination. And this film industry, those days we didn't go abroad. Okay, Evening in Paris was one little stint. There was few films were being made abroad. Otherwise, we went to Kashmir twice a year. And of course, we gave a lot of visibility to Kashmir, but sadly, we didn't give visibility to the Kashmiris. So probably India would have got to know Kashmiris better had we done that. But we always had, the sad thing now I would say from our time, a few losses that has happened. One is that the language, that we had this wonderful Hindustani, which had, it sounded so much nicer, and especially romantic scenes, if somebody told you a lovely shairi or something, there was a little bit of romance in it. Try saying that in English. It's not. So now all the Urdu words have been replaced with English. And Jab Bhi Met, and that kind of, that's the scene now. And the other thing is that we always had a Sardar gentleman or a Muslim gentleman as a friend or something, which created empathy amongst the audience and some kind of recognition and acceptance. That has disappeared totally. And the rural India, the poor India, the food-deprived India, digitally deprived India. Of course, we didn't have digital in our time, but I'm just saying that India is no longer visible in our media or in our television or anywhere, But the small towns have come up, the aspirational town, through IPL we met so many of them, through all these other things that TV does, reality contests and all that we've met. So the small town, Bareilly Ki Barfi, and that has come up. So, but this loss of language sometimes I feel is rather sad. Yes.
And loss of... when one talks about your career, the first thing that comes to mind is, of course, your relationship with Ray as a filmmaker. But you've had some exceptional relationships with directors other than Ray as well. You've worked with Gulzar, you've worked with Hrishikesh Mukherjee. It's difficult to talk about your entire career in Hindi cinema in such a short time span, but I would like to know that what are the director-actor relationships, or maybe actor-actor relationships, that stand out for you when you look back at your career in Hindi cinema in particular?
No, I was very fortunate, but right at the beginning of my career, immediately after Kashmir Ki Kali, I was working in a film called Devar, which was with Dharmendra, which was a very, very good film. Then Anupama came very soon after that. That was Rishikesh Mukherjee. And I was working with Bimal Roy, but then unfortunately he wasn't well, so that didn't happen. But so, I would do a kind of Evening in Paris kind of a film. Immediately after Evening in Paris, there was Aradhna, then there was Safar. So, and incredibly, I worked with a lot of Bengali directors. Ashit Sen was Bengali, Rishikesh Mukherjee was Bengali, Shakti Samanta was Bengali. So, so I've had, and I've had a wonderful rapport with most of the directors. And I've worked with Manmohan Desai also. And so I've had a mix of everything. And Evening in Paris was, that was the time because earlier the heroines were supposed to be very goody-goody. And there was nothing better than a good cry, although Rajesh Khanna very sort of said, I hate tears, etc. But the audience loved tears. The more the heroine cried, the more they enjoyed the film, you see. So that was a given. But that, and the vamp, of course, had the most, the nicer parts because they all dressed well and they wore modern clothes and they danced and they had this, they had a good time. Although they were called Lilies and Susies, and it can't be, proper names. It has to be somebody else a little far removed. And they lived in dark places like clubs and all that. But they had a far more interesting, they were, and the heroines were all helpless and wringing hands all the time, and putting everybody else before themselves, right? Very sacrificing, good human beings. So they couldn't possibly do vamp roles. But then suddenly one day the producers felt that, hey, why don't we do a double role? Like, the heroine can be vamp as well as a goody-goody and a baddie-baddie. How about that? So you get two in one. So that's what Evening in Paris was about. But then again, the bad girl really sacrifices for the hero. So the hero was always the center of everything. So, and then the 70s was very interesting also. So, the moment the people started changing, the narrative started changing. So earlier people couldn't accept, like I said, a heroine doing a vampish role or a hero doing a bad, a villain's role. But today there is so much churning.
Sorry to cut you, but even in your time, you still, even in that scenario, managed to have roles such as, playing a prostitute who did not want to be
Prostitute is very, very politically
incorrect word, but that's exactly
what.
what
Sex worker,
sex
please.
Yeah. But that is what it was called when you were doing it. I don't think sex workers was invented as a phrase back then. And who did not want to be rescued, who was not unhappy with her life.
Yes, I've had two films in my career which in Bombay. One is Safar and one is Mausam. Both the women have agency. In Safar, she's in love with two people. She finally marries Feroz. And Feroz is extremely jealous of the other person. And he commits suicide. And before dying, he says, don't tell anybody that you have given me poison with your own hands. And then she's accused of murder. But she doesn't buy that. She doesn't play the victim. And the tagline says that here's a woman who never looked back. She carries on and then she becomes a doctor. She is a doctor, but she lives her. So I like that, which was more like what was happening in the outside world. It was not that male gaze of, women had no agency and they couldn't take. What about Three Idiots for that, which was everybody must have seen it 100 times, even here. a girl who's a doctor, who has given birth, who produced a child through this, whatever you call it, through television or, that kind of a thing, presumably very intelligent, right? But she has no idea that she's in love with this person or not. It requires Amir to tell her that, hello, you're not in love with this person. And not once, but twice. He rescues her. She doesn't have that much intelligence that, this is not love. So it's always very male-centric. Like, the man has to guide you even to the extent of saying who are you in love with or you're not. So, yeah. So Safar was different, and so was Mawsam, although she is a sex worker, but she doesn't apologize for that. Whereas in Dirty Picture, which is fantastic, which Vidya Balan is, fabulous, but she becomes a victim, right? She starts drinking, and then she dies. Because the director loses faith. She cannot be alive. So these are the subtexts of the film, where it clearly says that if you deviate from your path, then you will not meet a good end. Like in Amar Prem, if she becomes a very successful singer, and the film wouldn't run for 2 weeks. But whereas if you are sacrificing and doing all that the society expects from a woman, then it'll run forever.
Speaking of agency very quickly, it made me think of Basu Bhattacharya's films as well,
yes.
And Avishkar, of course, which is a very, very complex film, but also the other one, whose name I'm forgetting, where when she finds out her husband is cheating, she's just like liberated, and she says, that particular dialogue that wouldn't I want to meet
yes.
My son's
It is
girlfriend.
one of my favorite films, is Viha Pravesh, yes.
Yeah, but moving on, because the bell has rung, and speaking of marriage, I'm very curious to know, you were surrounded by handsome men in the industry, and yet you fell in love with Tiger. And how did that happen? How did you meet him?
I'll tell you a secret. When you're working with all these handsome men, we are only conscious of our profile. We are only conscious of how we are looking on the screen. And so is the handsome man. If you're not giving him, he says, no, it's not looking right. And of course, the handsome man wins all the time. Yeah. So it's a very selfish profession, It's not everything that you see. It's only hard work and, all that. But, because when you're working, you become kind of blasé with each other, really. I don't think. And you see each other's... I don't think a studio is a place conducive for romance. Outdoors, maybe. Yeah. There you can kind of think. And there are a lot of marriages that is happening now amongst film fraternity, because those are the only people you really see. But in our time, I don't think there were any young men, were there? They were all, they were so old. Dilip Kumar. I don't think so. Except Kaka and I were the same age, Rajesh Khanna and I. Because otherwise, all the actors that I worked with were much, much older. That's again, you see, the woman has to be very slim and attractive, and the men can put on weight. But thank God that has changed, because there are now so many women in the audience who are now setting the rule. They said, no, we don't accept that paunch anymore. Now you have to look good and look cool. But otherwise, I think, I better not say it, but in some other industry, it's still carrying on. That there's still the girl has
we
to
all
be
know
very
which
young,
industries you're referring to.
But the others can be as old as they want. Yeah. So I don't think that romance was out of the question. And I've always wanted a life outside of the, I didn't think that life begins and ends in that periphery of the studio.
It was a marriage, seemingly sort of made in heaven. I have heard that bell, thank you. But also such a clash of cultures in a sense. I mean, you came from very different worlds.
I
You
don't-
had a very unconventional marriage as well. You were not always together, staying together. You also, and this was a striking choice for your time, continued to work not only after getting married but also having your first child. What kind of a partnership was it? I'm sorry to make you have to, ask you to sum it up very quickly, but I can't also.
Yeah, we can't really sum that up quickly because it took a lot of work and a lot of effort. Because when you're somebody's daughter, you're a daughter, right? Then you become somebody's wife, but you don't cease to be a daughter. So you're a daughter and a wife, and then the children arrive. Then you have daughter, wife, and mother. So that part is a bit difficult because an adult memory is retentive. So you can not see each other because Tiger used to disappear in Australia and West Indies for months on time. And when I used to ring up Tiger, the call used to go via London. So you can imagine we used to end up by talking to the operator more. We didn't have cell phone this. And it was anyway. So shortly, so it was, it's a division of 24 hours at the end of the day. So you have to prioritize. And Tiger was a kind of a different, and he didn't really, I don't know, he was different. He didn't mind my popularity. He didn't mind my going away to work, And he always said that there is many actors out there, but there's only one cricket captain. So he wasn't at all threatened by my popularity. But when the children came, because caregiving, like you asked you were going to ask me that, can women have it all? And then, meaning that I've had it all. But can a man have it all? Can a man manage his house and go to work and look after children? He doesn't. Without a wife, he'll be hopeless, So he has. So the society has given, the job of looking after or bringing up children to the woman. I mean, it's not made in heaven. This is the society has decreed that this is how it has to happen. And so I taught my children basically to respect my work and to wish me 10 on 10 when I went to work. So they do understand 10 on 10. So they were very proud of me that I was working. And also Tiger was very helpful. He didn't have a 9-to-5 job. So he and I did share, sometimes when he was away on tours, then I would not. And I had to give up because what happens, as Marianne Slaughter would call it, women's unfinished business, because caregiving and career, you have to really make very hard decisions. And your income then would come down by half, if not more. And if you give up completely, then people move ahead, and then you've lost that place, even if they allow your maternity leave or whatever. And if you can get even nannies to look after your children, but the nanny in turn is leaving her child behind. So caregiving and career is still not balancing out for women. And that is the unfinished business, and then we have to really go forward with that. But that is it, because the first 5 years of a child's life, and children's memory is not retentive. They need you when they need you. They can't retain that and talk about it later. So you cannot compromise on the parenting bit. So we need more house husbands, and we need a little bit of sharing of chores, thank you. And, a few women are around, but the men are not clapping. But, but we need to not have this very rigid rules that you do this and I do that. All the religious festivals, all the Karwa Chauths and all that are done by women, right? And the men are muh dikha ke chale jayenge, that we did come to your wedding, we've done this, that they'll be in one corner drinking or doing whatever. But it's the women who are doing. So without the women, I don't think men can have a life either.
It's rare to have a conversation who's set an example, not just with their professional, but also their personal life. So this was indeed a privilege.
Thank you.
I believe our time is over. But I will not let you go without urging you to write a memoir, because no 45-minute conversation can do justice to your story.
Thank you. Thank you.
There, you heard it from the audience. Thank you very much.